In this module we're going to talk about periodic maintenance on sharded clusters. Now you'll probably remember that a little while ago we covered the rolling maintenance methodology for replica sets, and as part of that the philosophy was to minimize any downtime. That methodology still applies when we get to sharded clusters, because don't forget, each shard is usually a replica set itself. So the methodology we covered for doing rolling maintenances on a single replica set still applies even when they're part of a sharded cluster, which is good news. So we don't have to do anything special when we're doing the maintenance itself on the replica sets, and so replica sets are basically covered. However, replica sets are not the only components of our sharded cluster. We have added new components to that sharded cluster, those being the config servers, which we were just talking about in the previous modules, and the MongoOS processes themselves that will be routing things to the various shards. So how do these new components factor into our general periodic maintenance type of work? Well, when we were covering replica sets, you'll remember that we had various different things that you might do on a secondary. Those included building indexes, those included doing compacts and repairs, they included also doing upgrades. Now some of those things don't apply to these new components. You're never going to have to compact or repair a MongoOS process. You're never going to have to compact or repair a config server usually either. So those are kind of out. Indexes, again, you don't have indexes on a MongoOS process, and the indexes on a config server are going to be static and managed by the system itself anyway. So this is not something you'll be adding to yourself. So what else could come in? Well, there is backups. You don't take a backup of the MongoOS process, so that's fine, not an issue. You will be taking a backup of the config server, but the config server is usually quite small in terms of its data footprint. The largest clusters can have large config servers, and in that case you may have to take separate measures, but for the most part config servers are actually quite small. It can be backed up using MongoDump. That can be done in real time. There's no need to take any downtime there. If you do need to back up a config server, there's a very simple way to make sure that there are no changes, and we've essentially already covered it, but let's just mention it here again. So if you want to back up a config server, you have 3 of them, and we know that if one of these config servers is down, the other 2 become read-only. No changes to the metadata can be made because you can't satisfy the 2-phase commit protocol here, and your metadata is essentially read-only. The nice sort of benefit of that is that it's perfect for backup purposes. So in other words, as soon as you take a config server out of rotation, that config server will still be the same as these 2. No new writes are going to happen in the meantime, so you can just use the config server that you've taken down to do your backup. So that's sort of a handy little consequence of what's normally not a terribly wonderful thing to have happen, taking a config server down. The one concern that you need to take into account: don't take the first config server down. If you're going to use a config server for backup, make it the 2nd or 3rd config server in that config database string that you're passing to your MongoOS. And we've already covered the reason for that. The first config server in that string is the primary target for all reads from MongoOSs, and it can have more of an impact taking this one down than taking the 3rd one down. So take the 2nd or 3rd config database down, make your backup. You can just do a file-based backup, or you could use MongoDump and point it directly at the database files themselves, and that gives you a point-in-time snapshot, if you like, of the config database. You can also just run a MongoDump against it at any given particular stage, but if you want to be precise about it, you want to have a definite, at this point in time I had the config server as it was then, just take one offline, make your backup, and bring it back up. That's backups covered. We've already covered index builds, not applicable. We've already covered compacts and repairs, again, not going to be applicable here. But there is one process that does apply to both replica sets, config servers, MongoOSs, and that is upgrades.